They were going to kill him if they found him, and that's why she had to hide him under the floor you are standing on. Because this isn't a story about a convent, this is a story about a hospital that never officially existed and the nun who built it with her own hands while enemy soldiers marched right above her head. And if you think you know how brave a person can be, you haven't met her yet. And before we go deeper into this hidden world, I want to welcome you, because if you love real, powerful stories of hidden courage like this one, you are exactly where you belong. This is The Secret Nun, so make sure you subscribe and stay with me till the very end, because the way she saved the 2000th soldier will give you chills. She wasn't supposed to be a hero, and that's why this story matters so much, because Sister Agnes was just 34 years old when the war came to her quiet town in northern France, and she had lived in the same stone convent since she was 19, so she knew every hallway and every creaking stair, and she knew the sound the old church bell made when it rained, and because she knew that convent so well, she also knew about the space underneath it that no one talked about anymore. It was a forgotten cellar, and it had been sealed for decades because the old sisters said it was damp and unsafe, so no one went down there, and that's exactly why it became the perfect place to save lives, because the safest place to hide something is where everyone believes there is nothing to find. When the occupation began, everything changed overnight, and the German command took over the town hall and the school and the main roads, so the convent was ordered to stay quiet and stay out of the way, and the sisters were told they would be watched, and because they were watched, they couldn't do anything openly, and that's why Sister Agnes had to learn to do everything in secret. The first soldier came on a rainy night in October, and he wasn't a soldier anymore in the way you think, because he was 18, he was bleeding from his leg, and he was wearing a torn French uniform, and he knocked on the back kitchen door not because he was brave but because he had nowhere else to go, so Sister Agnes opened the door and she saw his eyes, and because she saw his eyes she couldn't close that door again. She pulled him inside quickly, and she knew if the patrols found him there they would punish the entire convent, so she had to make a choice in seconds, and because she chose compassion over safety, she dragged him past the kitchen and toward the small wooden door that led to the old cellar, and she lifted the heavy rug and opened that door for the first time in 20 years, and the smell of cold stone and earth came up, and she knew this was the only chance he had. She hid him down there on an old table, and she cleaned his wound with shaking hands, and because she had only basic medicine, she used what the convent had, which was alcohol and clean sheets torn into strips, and she stayed with him all night, and because she stayed, he lived until morning. And that morning changed everything, because she realized this wouldn't be just one soldier, so she started to think differently, and because she started to think differently, she started to see the cellar not as a storage room but as a possibility. She went to Mother Superior and she whispered what she had done, and Mother Superior was terrified at first, because she knew the risk was death for them all, so she wanted to say no, but then she looked at Sister Agnes and she saw that this wasn't about rebellion, it was about faith, and because it was about faith, she quietly said we will do what God asks us to do, even if the world says not to, and that's how the secret hospital was born without anyone ever saying the words out loud. They started small, and because they started small they could keep it hidden, so Sister Agnes cleared the cellar with 2 other trusted sisters at night when everyone else was asleep, and they moved the old barrels and the broken chairs, and they swept the stone floor until their hands bled, and because they worked in silence, no one outside heard them. Then she needed beds, and she couldn't buy beds without raising suspicion, so she collected old wooden pallets from the barn and covered them with straw and blankets, and because that wasn't enough, she asked the local farmer, who was a kind man, for extra straw for the winter, and he gave it without asking questions, and that's how the first 6 beds were made without anyone noticing. The hardest part was medicine, and because the army controlled all the medical supplies, she had to get creative, so she started walking to the town clinic with the other sisters to pray for the sick, and while they prayed, she quietly took small things that wouldn't be missed, like bandages and iodine and pain powder, and she hid them in the pockets of her habit, and because her habit was large and heavy, no one ever checked, so every week she brought back a little more. She also learned which wild plants could help with infection, and because she had grown up in the countryside before joining the convent, she remembered what her grandmother taught her about yarrow and honey for wounds, so she started collecting those in the forest on her morning walks, and because no one suspects a nun picking herbs, she could gather enough to make a difference. Soon the second soldier came, and then the third, and because word spread quietly through the resistance that the convent was safe, more came, and that's why the cellar that once held 6 beds had to hold 10, and then 15, and then 20. She created a system, and because a system was the only way to keep 2,000 people alive without being caught, she made rules that every sister followed without question. The first rule was silence, so no one in the hospital could speak above a whisper after sunset, and because sound travels through stone, they learned to communicate with taps and with small hand signals, and that's how they moved 20 wounded men without making a sound that could be heard upstairs. The second rule was light, so they could only use 2 small oil lamps at a time, and they covered the windows to the cellar with thick black cloth, and because of that, the cellar was always dim and warm from the bodies inside, and that's why the soldiers called it the breathing basement. The third rule was the most important, and it was that no soldier stayed longer than they had to, so as soon as a man could walk, he was moved through the tunnel at the far end of the cellar, and that tunnel was the real miracle, because it was an old drainage passage that connected the convent cellar to the woods behind the cemetery, and Sister Agnes found it when she was cleaning, and because she found it, she had an escape route that the Germans never discovered. She widened that tunnel with her own hands, and she did it inch by inch with a small shovel while lying on her stomach, and because she did it at night for months, her knees were always bruised and her hands were always raw, but she never complained, so the passage became wide enough for a man to crawl through, and that's how they moved soldiers out under the noses of the guards. The way it worked was simple and terrifying, so every time a new soldier arrived, they would be brought through the kitchen after dark, and they would be taken down the wooden stairs and laid on a pallet, and Sister Agnes would examine them immediately, and because she wasn't a doctor, she learned to be one. So she learned to stitch wounds by practicing on cloth and to set broken bones by watching what little she could see at the clinic, and because she had to learn fast, she made mistakes, and those mistakes haunted her, but she kept going because stopping meant someone would die. She had help, and because no one can save 2,000 people alone, she had 2 sisters who were brave beyond words, Sister Claire who was calm under pressure and Sister Lucille who was only 22 but could keep a secret better than anyone. So the 3 of them ran the hospital in shifts, 1 sleeping while 2 worked, and because they worked like that, the hospital never closed, not for a single day in almost 4 years. The food was the next impossible problem, and because feeding 20 hungry soldiers plus 12 sisters on rations meant for 12 was mathematically impossible, they had to cheat the system every single day, so they started baking extra bread and saying it was for the poor, and they watered down the soup for themselves so the soldiers could have the thicker part, and they traded the convent's wine with farmers for potatoes and eggs, and because the farmers respected the nuns, they never asked where the extra food was going, so the soldiers ate just enough to heal. The scariest moments were the inspections, and because the Germans inspected the convent every 2 weeks, they had to make the hospital disappear in minutes, so they created a drill that they practiced like a prayer. When the sister on watch at the upstairs window rang the small bell 2 times, that meant soldiers are coming. So everyone in the cellar had to freeze, and the lamps were blown out, and the heavy rug was pulled back over the wooden door, and a large, heavy cabinet that took 4 sisters to move was pushed over the trapdoor, and because that cabinet was always kept full of heavy prayer books, no soldier could lift it quickly, so when the Germans walked through the kitchen and the pantry and looked around, they saw only nuns praying quietly, and that's why they never found the hospital even though they were standing right on top of it. One time they almost got caught, and that's a moment Sister Agnes never forgot, because a German officer decided to search the lower storage room and he noticed the floor sounded hollow when he stepped near the trapdoor, so he knocked on it with his boot and he asked what is under here, and Sister Agnes felt her heart stop, but she had prepared for this, so she answered calmly that it was an old flooded well that was unsafe and full of rats, and because she said it with such a steady voice and because she opened a small bucket of dirty water to show him the smell, he wrinkled his nose and said close it, so he left, and because he left, 20 men kept breathing that night. The numbers started to grow in a way that even she didn't expect, so in the first year they saved about 300 men, and because the front line moved closer in the second year, they saved almost 700 more, and by the third year, when the fighting was at its worst, they were hiding 35 soldiers at a time in a space meant for storage, so men were lying shoulder to shoulder, and the air was thick, but they were alive, and because they were alive, they cried quietly when Sister Agnes whispered to them that they were safe now. She kept a secret book, and because she knew every life mattered, she wrote down every name she could learn, or a description if they couldn't speak, and she hid that book inside the hollow base of the statue of Saint Teresa in the chapel, and that's why we know today that she saved 2,000 soldiers, because that book survived the war even when so many other records did not. Not everyone made it, and because war is cruel, she lost 47 men in that cellar, and she prayed over every single one, and she and the sisters buried them at night in the convent garden and marked the graves with simple white stones with no names, so the Germans would think they were old graves, and because she did that with respect, those families later found their sons and brothers after the war because of her book. The most powerful part of this story isn't just the hiding, it's how she got them out, because saving them was only half the job, so she worked with the French resistance, and a young baker named Henri would come to the convent every Monday and Thursday to deliver bread, and he was the messenger, so Sister Agnes would slip him a tiny piece of paper with a number on it, and that number told him how many soldiers were ready to move, and that night, the resistance would wait in the woods by the cemetery, and one by one, the soldiers would crawl through the drainage tunnel, and because the tunnel was tight and dark and full of cold water, it was terrifying, but it led to freedom, so they crawled anyway, and Henri would guide them to the next safe house. This went on for 1,412 days, and because it went on for so long, Sister Agnes never slept a full night in almost 4 years, so her eyes were always tired but her hands were always steady, and the other sisters said she seemed to get her strength from somewhere beyond herself, and that's why the soldiers who met her never forgot her face, even decades later. When liberation finally came in the summer of 1944, the American troops arrived first, and they found a quiet convent with a small garden and a group of thin, exhausted nuns, and they had no idea what had happened under their feet, so Sister Agnes walked them to the kitchen, and she moved the cabinet, and she pulled back the rug, and she opened the wooden door, and she led them down the stone stairs with a lamp, and because the lamplight hit the row of empty straw pallets and the shelves of homemade bandages and the small wooden cross on the wall, the soldiers understood in an instant, and one American captain fell to his knees and wept, and because he wept, his men wept too. In the days after, soldiers started coming back, not the wounded ones, but the ones she had saved who were now free, and they came with tears and with hugs and with letters from their mothers, and one by one they told the army what she had done, so the story of the secret hospital under the convent finally came out into the light, and because it came out, the French government and the Allies honored her quietly, but she didn't want medals, so she asked that the honor be shared with her sisters. And with the farmer and with Henri the baker, and because she asked, they were all remembered too. She lived a long, quiet life after the war, and she never spoke much about those years unless someone asked her directly, and when young sisters asked her how she found the courage to risk everything, she always said the same thing. She said courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about being afraid and still opening the door anyway, and because she said that, those young sisters understood that heroism isn't loud, it's a whisper in a dark cellar that says you are safe now. And that's why her book is so important, because inside that hollow statue they found not just names, but small notes she wrote beside them, like he had a laugh like my brother, or he missed his mother's soup, or he promised to plant a tree when he got home, and because she wrote those notes, we know she didn't see 2,000 soldiers, she saw 2,000 sons and brothers and fathers, and that's what made her different. If this story moved you, I want you to do something for me right now in the comments. Tell me which part hit your heart the most. Was it the tunnel she dug with her own hands, or the way she almost got caught but stayed calm, or the moment the American captain cried when he saw the empty beds? Because I read every comment and your words keep these hidden stories alive. And if you know someone who needs to hear about a real hero today, someone who loves history or needs a reminder that one person can change thousands of lives, please share this story with them, because sharing it is how we make sure Sister Agnes and her 2,000 soldiers are never forgotten. And if you haven't already, join our family here on The Secret Nun and subscribe and hit the bell, because every week I bring you another hidden story of courage just like this one, a story that history tried to bury but that deserves to be told, and I don't want you to miss the next one. Thank you for listening with your heart today, and remember, sometimes the greatest hospitals have no sign outside, and sometimes the bravest soldiers wear a habit instead of a uniform, and because one nun refused to look away, 2,000 men got to go home, and that's a light that even the darkest war could never put out.